Hello, my name is Kris Dickson. This is my introduction to my psychological skills training program for a 14-year-old tennis player starting high school next year. I sat down with this player who also happens to be my son. We sat down for an interview and discussed his involvement in sport, what he deems his psychological strengths and weaknesses, boundaries of specific problems, and also his relationship with his coach. He reported several memorable events, both positive and negative, but I'll touch on just one of each, positive and negative. For the positive, I asked if it was his first ever tournament win, and he said no. He said his most memorable positive experience was during lessons when he was 8 years old. He was in a 2-on-2 or doubles drill against a 16-year-old girl and her partner, during which he returned her shots not once but twice, with the second one forcing her error and knocking her out of the drill, which I thought was interesting, and he was pretty excited about that and remembers this pretty vividly because he knows how good of a player she was and how he was just starting out at the time, and he was able to execute the ground stroke correctly and make it pretty close to unreachable for her. The negative event that he remembers was actually during a tournament. It was during tournament play, his very first tournament in one of our local tournaments here, and he was playing a notably inferior opponent, one he knew he had the skills to beat, yet he lost very decisively, 2 games to 6 and 1 game to 6. He was playing against a kid that was playing very defensively, wasn't playing him like he was used to with a solid, fast-paced ground strokes. He was lobbing a lot, and my son wasn't he wasn't proficient at returning that type of shot, and was very impatient about it, and he lost. And he remembers that very vividly. So we talked a lot about those skills that his psychological strengths and weaknesses. Of those, we found that his strengths, or what he considers his strengths, are achievement drive. He's very driven player. Doesn't have any problem with that type of motivation. He's very self-aware. He realizes that he does have some things he needs to work on, and I think he identifies those, or he's been able to identify those and recognize them. But I don't think he also recognizes that he doesn't have the tools to fix them. He believes that his self-awareness is pretty high. Like I said, his attentional focus is also very high. He's pretty good at staying on task, and when he's instructed to do something, he's very coachable in doing it, and I think he realizes that. He also has a very high level of interpersonal competence. He works well with others, works well with his coach, and he takes instruction well. What he recognizes as weaknesses, and what I agree with, are his productive thinking. He tends to think very negatively about himself, see himself in a very negative light. Also, his self-confidence, or his self-efficacy, actually, more to the point, is fairly low. He doesn't consider himself very good at playing tennis, and even though his coach and I and several others, instruct him otherwise, he doesn't believe it, and so that obviously needs to be addressed. Also, his perceptual cognitive skill, or his decision making. He tends to get caught up in the negative thought process and makes poor or no decision really on tactics and strategy throughout the match. Doesn't he knows he doesn't anticipate the other player, and has a difficult time keeping up with the pace of the match, adjusting his footwork and position in order to respond to the next stroke. Also, his energy management he recognized as being subpar, in that he has a very high level of anxiety and has a difficult time managing that anxiety, managing his stress levels, and his overall activation level is tough for him to manage as well. Also, this one I found kind of interesting was his identity achievement. He doesn't identify himself as a tennis player. He started playing ice hockey when he was 5 years old and became pretty good at playing goalie. And he has always looked at that as his favorite sport. Didn't pick up tennis until he was 8. Has become equally, if not more, proficient at that sport, but has always identified himself as an ice hockey player, even though we're in the middle of the desert and there is no ice out here. So that's an issue, and I think he sees that, and I think that's a big player in the self-efficacy portion, because he sees himself as an ice hockey player, and has a hard time seeing himself, visualizing himself, I guess, getting better at playing tennis when he's not identifying himself as that type of athlete. So we talked about also about his relationship with his coach, and he has a really good relationship with his coach. It seems very friendly, amicable. He feels connected with him, that he can talk to him about anything and get feedback. Feels very comfortable, not awkward at all. And they have kind of a thing, when his coach gets upset with other players, he tends to reflect that on others. And my son, he picks up on this, and when he sees that, or when he feels that the anger toward him or the angst towards him is unjustified, he attempts to push his coach's buttons by performing even worse. The coach typically recognizes this and brings everything to a halt to recage everyone. But that was kind of an interesting dynamic that he brought up. But overall, he thinks he's learning a lot, and in general, likes learning from his coach. So I think that's good that they have that type of relationship, and I think that's going to continue to foster his growth. So I administered the sports competition anxiety test, and not surprisingly, the test indicated that he had a high level of anxiety, and so we talked about a little bit about that, tools to help deal with that anxiety. I just asked him a few questions just to kind of rate himself on a scale of 1 to 10. His self-efficacy, which he rated himself a 7. How well he controlled his emotions, he rated himself a 6. And he does tend to get very angry at himself, I've noticed. How well he controlled his arousal or activation. He said he thought he was an 8, that he could control his energy level pretty well. But controlling anxiety, he rated himself as a 4, that he had a really difficult time. Not such a difficult time the night before the match, but as the match drew closer, the day of, and then a few hours before and up to a few minutes before, his anxiety level noticeably increased. Also, coping with stress, his ability to turn it to eustress, he rated as a 4. So as far as anxiety and stressors go, very low. He had a very low self-rating there. So we talked a little bit about methods and techniques. The difference between methods and techniques, and I think he understood those pretty well, and knew that we had to use specific methods in order to develop techniques to combat these issues. So we talked about goal setting, short-term, long-term process and performance goals, and I think he took to that very positively. We talked about different forms of dealing with his stressors, like relaxation, breathing exercises, progressive relaxation, visualization, autogenic training, or self-hypnosis, and then combining the two, visualization and autogenic training. Once he learned that technique, which by all accounts takes a few months to do. We also talked about imagery and how to recreate in his mind the perfect execution of a particular technique, and then get his brain to fire the appropriate muscles and be able to perform that technique himself. Developing vivid images, controlling those images, and then increasing his self-awareness to recognize negative thoughts as they creep in, and to eradicate those. We talked about something I think is particularly important in the sport of tennis, which is self-talk. By keeping it positive and lively, he can change his mood, control his effort, and direct his action and sustain it. Like I said, this is particularly, I think, important in the sport of tennis, since coaching is not allowed during a tennis match. Therefore, the player must learn to coach himself, in a sense, throughout the match, and the self-talk comes in as a big part of this, I think. So that concludes my introduction. I hope you find my PST program both relevant and engaging, and I look forward to your feedback.